I freely confess, a man of puzzling contradictions. Poverty drives my family from our Scottish homeland to seek our fortune in the New World. And what riches I gather about me.
Andrew Carnegie begins with nothing. And through hard work, perseverance, and being in the right place at the right time, he is able to become really a multi-billionaire.
My steel industry helps construct modern America, creates monstrous instruments of war, and makes me the richest man in the world. Then, I give away every cent of my money to benefit others and to foster peace in war-torn lands.
Here was a Scotsman who left Scotland penniless, went to America, became the richest man in the world, and then decided to invest his fortune for the common good. That's a story worth telling.
I'm a New Yorker, so I had grown up with the man. I thought the man whose biography I was going to write was called Carnegie. The first call I made when I introduced myself, and the relative on the other end of the line said, "Young man, if you were going to write about my great-great-grandfather, get the name right."
No one pronounces his name properly anymore. He's now Carnegie. So if you go to America and say, "Oh, have you been to the Carnegie Library?" They're like, "Who?" But they've all heard of Carnegie Hall.
Andrew Carnegie was born in 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland, a tiny little town.
I grew up in the attic of a small one-story house on the corner of Moody Street and Priory Lane. My childhood home is full of my parents' love for me and philanthropy for others.
Andrew Carnegie lived in a world where the artisans, the workers, the weavers were all educated. They were politically minded, and Carnegie grew up listening to his father and his friends debate the issues of the day. So Carnegie was interested in the world outside him.
Just a few miles from Edinburgh, our small town is the beating heart of the weaving trade. On his handlooms, my father weaves fine linen tablecloths. But factories are springing up to threaten his gentle way of life. We are on the brink of monumental change. This unprecedented explosion of new ideas and new technological inventions leaves a trail of devastation. My father sells his last cloth, and I learn what poverty means. Then and there came my resolve. I will cure such poverty when I come to be a man.
The Carnegie family, like all of the other weavers, went into economic depression in the 1840s. So his mother, Margaret, decided that the only way to protect her children as they grew up, to make sure that they would prosper, was to bring them to the United States.
The Industrial Revolution forces us to forsake our beloved Scotland and seek a new life in the New World. I leave Dunfermline with tearful eyes not knowing if I will ever return. Yet my optimism abounds with the thought of reaching America. After a grueling 3-month crossing, we arrive in this land of opportunity. We are destined for greatness. The great Allegheny Mountains greet us with their magnitude and rugged charm.
You have families coming from all over the world for this opportunity, for that piece of the pie, to be American, to build a more successful future. Why does my family come here? It's opportunity. It's opportunity that doesn't exist in old world Europe. Folks are able to come here and get a job that's fairly well paying. As far as the industrial pool, you know, what's grabbing them and bringing them to this country, it's that heavy manufacturing.
My first job as a bobbin boy earns me $1.20 a week. The hours hang heavy upon me, and in the work itself, I take no pleasure. But I am now a breadwinner, a helper for my family.
Pittsburgh is the poster child of the American Industrial Revolution. This is a place where ingenuity and capital and labor all came together. And that hope that by working hard and pushing forward that you're going to achieve something that your parents couldn't achieve.
When he arrived in America, I think he was determined that he was going to do better. And I think that steely Scottish determination was something that stood him in good stead.
I progressed to telegraph operator, then superintendent with the railroad. I am determined to build my fortune.
He rose up and learned how to invest money. In fact, doing things which we would regard as probably illegal today, using inside information to buy up shares in the companies that were then going to be favored with contracts from the railroad.
Government in the United States did not regulate the economy, and that meant that men of business could proceed using their wiles, using practices that would today be known as illegal.
He began to accumulate a fortune, and in due course, again through the railways, he got, of course, into iron manufacture for bridge building, for rails, and latterly into steel.
Investing my capital, but still working with the railroad, my riches are enhanced by the bloody horrors of the Civil War. This conflict devours all resources. Railroads are essential for transporting the modern machinery of war. War is becoming a money-making machine. But the human cost is appalling. What value has money when lives are the price?
Without Pittsburgh and without what was being produced here, the North couldn't have won. That's what the North had over the South, these manufacturing bases. And Pittsburgh's at the epicenter of it.
Railroads are getting built to transport troops and supplies. Railroads are also getting destroyed in the course of the war itself. So after the war, the steel industry is ripe to expand, to do a lot of the rebuilding of the infrastructure that was destroyed during the war. The raw need for steel puts Andrew Carnegie in the right place at the right time.
His ambition, his charm, and his self-confidence gave him the ability to take risks with his money, to jump into new enterprises, to invest in steel when everybody else was investing in iron, to build new plants, to reinvest his dividends, never to take money out of his business, but to keep putting it in, getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, expanding always.
I mull over my station in life. This year yields me a bountiful and growing return. But there is more to life than material triumphs. I propose to take an income no greater than $50,000 per annum, but spend the surplus each year for benevolent purposes. The more I earn, the more I can give away. And for the next 20 years, the fast-changing American economy allows my wealth to grow and grow.
So now we're going over the Monongahela River. Monongahela River, through most of the 20th century, was considered the hardest working river in the world. There were more steel mills and industry along this river than anywhere else in the world. But when I was a kid, and when my father was a kid and his father, these rivers were dead. They were so full of pollutants that nothing could survive in them. And the air quality was so poor from all of these mills that by midday, you'd have to change your shirt because it was black. We're headed down into the town of Braddock. Braddock is historically, not just for this region, but for this country, one of the most important little towns that no one knows about. By the early 1870s, it's home to Carnegie Steel. It was the very first Carnegie's mills to open in 1875, and it's the only fully integrated steel mill, meaning going from raw material to iron, from iron to steel, and steel to, in this case, semi-finished product. It's the only one left in this entire state. But in the heyday of this town, this place was bustling. It really was a very, large and active town for many, many years, and it's all because that mill was here. It really was unparalleled for such a small little space. They had 30,000 people in this town.
Over the river in Homestead, I build a new mill, insisting upon knowing our costs, and especially what each man is doing. Who saves material, who wastes it, and who produces the results.
Homestead's very different than a number of the other mill towns in this region, because Homestead's founded with this notion of being a workers' republic. It's not a company town. They had a highly organized labor force, and they didn't have to kowtow to anyone. This was their town. These men were steadfast in their commitment to keeping their place in this mill. So there's labor problems from the beginning. But there's an economic downturn, price of steel drops, the wages go down accordingly. Carnegie felt that, if we're not making as much money, you shouldn't be making as much money.
My workers refuse to see reason. Advances asked for are ridiculous. These men are in the wrong.
Andrew Carnegie delegated responsibility for labor relations in Pittsburgh to Henry Frick. Carnegie needed Frick, who was a brilliant manager.
He brings him in because Frick was notorious at busting unions. No tolerance for unions at all.
Frick precipitated an ugly, nasty strike.
He was just the man that Carnegie needed to take care of this labor problem. He was the bad cop, the Carnegie's good cop.
Instructing Frick to shut down the plant and wait until the workers buckled will prove to be something I live to regret.
Things heat up, they cool down, they heat up, they cool down over the course of the day, and eventually shots are fired.
July the 6th, 1892, a bloody battle erupts between strikers and 300 armed security guards at my plant. Several souls die. Nothing has ever wounded me so deeply.
Who wins this battle in 1892? The standard line is that, the workers won the battle, but the company won the war. The union was crushed. It's 40 years before unionism is back in the steel business. To treat workers as he did, whether directly or indirectly, to expose people to the conditions that he did, to allow suffering to happen, are inexcusable. Does he make up for it?
In the 1880s, Carnegie publishes a very famous essay that's called Wealth. It's more popularly remembered as the Gospel of Wealth. The Gospel of Wealth offers propositions that Carnegie feels everyone needs to accept. You may not like them, but they are the way things are. First of all, great inequality is inevitable. People like him are going to continue accumulating vast fortunes that just a few years before would have been unimaginable. Men who build great fortunes really are smarter than the rest of us. They know how to amass wealth in a way that the rest of us don't.
I set down my essay into a kinetophone recording so that my message will echo down the years.
I quote from the Gospel of Wealth, published 25 years ago. This, then, is toiled to be the duty of the man of wealth. First, to set an example of modest, unostentatious living, shunning display. To provide moderately for the legitimate wants of those dependent upon him. And after doing so, to consider all surplus revenues which come to him simply as trust funds, which he is strictly bound, as a matter of duty, to administer in the manner which in his judgment is best calculated to produce the most beneficial results for the community.
Here was a millionaire telling all the other millionaires. Here was a robber baron, a captain of industry, telling his peers that they had to give away all their money. Not only that if if they didn't give away their money, they would die disgraced, unloved, scorned.
The man who dies thus rich dies disgraced.
What sets Carnegie apart from some of his brother millionaires is that men who build great fortunes didn't do that alone. Even though they are smarter, they've built these great fortunes using the labor and community that the rest of us provide. And therefore, those great fortunes are temporarily in the custody of a person like Carnegie, but they don't really belong to a person like Carnegie.
Andrew Carnegie was what we called a philanthropist. I remember that when we were children, very difficult word to spell. But somebody who gave away a lot of money, particularly for libraries and organs. And that was his mission in life, really, to make a lot of money and then to give it away. He had rather a good method. He didn't give you everything. That was his policy. If he gave, you had to give as well. So if you wanted to build a library, and he agreed to do it, he would either build the library, and you provided the books, or maybe you had to buy the land on which the library would be built. But that way, you had an ongoing interest in that project. Well, isn't that sensible? You know, if we get complete handouts, we don't value them. But if you put your blood, sweat, and tears into getting it, what you wanted, you will always value it.
I refined the worldwide giving of libraries into a neat and streamlined procedure, much like ordering a suit from the Sears catalogue.
Libraries were important to Carnegie because he believed in education, and he believed in doing everything he possibly could to bring to common people opportunities that might not be theirs.
With great wealth comes great responsibility. I think that's what Carnegie found. And that responsibility, I think, weighed quite heavily on his shoulders. Just having lots of zeros in the bank is nice for a little while, but then it's pretty unfulfilling. And it's not how many zeros you've got, it's actually what you do with them that marks you out. You know, he who dies thus wealthy dies disgraced. It's so powerful.
He truly believed in philanthropy, and he truly believed in bettering the lot in life for other Americans, particularly through education and literacy. But I also think that he was very much aware of his need for a legacy. And one of the ways to do that was through naming rights. Andrew Carnegie can't be thought of as an individual. He has to be thought of as a conglomerate of robber barons. People like Goodyear, Firestone, Ford, J.P. Morgan, that if you add them up, they controlled the industrial production of America. The impact of steel on the urban environment cannot be underestimated. It is absolutely crucial to almost every aspect of urban life that we take for granted every single day and multiple times a day. In New York City, if you wish to ride the subway, you're on steel rails. If you wish to take an elevator, you're probably going in a larger building, it's steel frame construction. The best example of steel in New York City is the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge is designed to bring together the ancient material of stone with this very fine, ethereal, new material of steel cabling. When the Brooklyn Bridge opens in the 1880s, it is more than twice the length in the center span than any suspension bridge that had ever come before it.
That change in metal, that roughly a couple percentages of carbon from iron to steel changes everything. You have a metal that is malleable. You can shape however you want. That maintains its strength. Without steel, the 20th century and now the 21st century as we know it wouldn't exist. It changes everything. So inside of this building, which used to be the blowing engine house, where huge air compressors were that created the wind that was then superheated to go into the blast furnace, we now have the 48-inch universal plate mill, which we salvaged in 1991 from the Homestead Works. This is the last of its type. This is a steam-driven plate mill. There's nothing else like this anywhere in this country. They're producing armor plate for battleships. It's the start of what's known as the Great White Fleet. Andrew Carnegie secures the largest contract with the U.S. Navy ever given.
For almost 3 decades, I dominate the steel industry. But now, at the dawn of the 20th century, I fear that the very thing that made my fortune is now in danger of destroying mankind. I must follow my beliefs and begin the harder task of giving my money away for the good of all. March the 2nd, 1901, I closed a deal with J.P. Morgan and sell Carnegie Steel for $480 million. I am the richest man in the world. Now I must turn to a new mission in life. The abolition of war grows in importance and overshadows all else.
Andrew Carnegie took a huge risk later in his life by calling for world peace. It's a pretty spectacular thing for him to do.
I think fundamentally he was a practical man, and he just thought it was wrong to kill your fellow man.
There's this contradiction that's Andrew Carnegie. On one hand, he's making millions and millions of dollars off of producing iron and then steel to go into armament to build up the US Navy. But at the same time, he's an avowed pacifist, that there is no reason for bloodshed, and that war is barbaric, it's archaic, that modern man shouldn't have to resort to such means. But that contradiction still exists. If you didn't need to resort to those means, why would you build a navy?
An age of new and fearsome weaponry is upon us. I fondly hope and strongly believe to hasten the coming of the day when men, disgracing humanity, shall cease to kill each other like wild beasts.
Where would we be without men and women who dream? And Carnegie dreamed. He had all sorts of elaborate plans that he put his money into. One of those was for a simplified spelling scheme. He thought the English language was much too complicated. Why should slay be spelled S-L-E-I-G-H? Why should G's sometimes be soft, sometimes be hard, sometimes not pronounced at all?
My quest for a simplified language has powerful support from Theodore Roosevelt, and importantly, I think this president to be a peacemaker. The hour and the man have come, and Roosevelt is that man of destiny.
Roosevelt was a Republican and Carnegie was a Republican. And Roosevelt, who many Republicans thought was anti-business, needed Carnegie by his side as proof that he was not anti-business, that he was pro-capitalist. So Carnegie gave him cover for some of his reform activities.
Despite Roosevelt ordering government documents printed with the new spellings, the cause is lost. My ideas must be dropped. Enough is enough.
The man had a sense of humor, he had wit, wisdom, and he believed in progress. He believed in evolution.
Rich and powerful people can usually have just about anything they want, but very few people can have their own dinosaur. And the story of how Diplodocus came here to Pittsburgh is a remarkable one. It starts with Andrew Carnegie reading a headline that screams, "Most colossal animal ever on Earth just found out west." And it has an illustration of one of these long-necked dinosaurs, these sauropod dinosaurs, rearing up on its hind legs to look into an 11th-story window. Carnegie sees this and he's captivated. He buys the story hook, line, and sinker. And he scrawls a note to the director of his newly founded museum, William Holland. And he says, "Dear Dr. Holland, can you please buy this for Pittsburgh?" So Holland, when he got this note, I have to buy a dinosaur, rendezvoused with the man who had discovered this supposedly gigantic dinosaur, a guy named William Harlow Reed. And that's when Reed sort of spilled the beans to them that the entire newspaper article, the entire, illustration, captivating headline, all this stuff, was based on a single chunk of dinosaur bone, about the size of your average microwave oven. So that naturally the Carnegie team was a little bit disappointed by this. And they had a few weeks of frustration. They searched and searched without finding much of anything. But on July 4th, 1899, the team happened upon a few bones that led to a few more bones, and they uncovered much of the skeleton of a single individual of one of these giant long-necked dinosaurs. And so I think having Diplodocus carnegii, his own species of dinosaur, and a dinosaur that very quickly became very famous, was a really nice feather in Andrew Carnegie's cap.
Across the Atlantic, I purchased my own Scottish Highland home and 40,000 acres of sweet pastoral scenery. I am a child with a new toy. Heaven itself is not nearly as beautiful as Skibo.
Skibo means enchanted place, and I think he wanted it to be something magical. When Andrew Carnegie bought Skibo, he instructed his agents to go out and look for a suitable place. It had to have water, it had to be near the sea, it had to have mountains and so on. And he saw it and he liked it straight away. Here was a man, the richest man in the world. They bought over steel from the United States. We know that he bought in electricity, of course, which was very key. And all these things would have been new to people in the Highlands. It was a remote part of the British Isles, so this was really exciting. Now, here we have probably the first electric lift in Scotland. And here it is, an Otis lift. It was bought in 1901, installed in 1902. And a little later on, Edward VII came to see it because he was remodeling Buckingham Palace and wanted to see firsthand some of these innovations that Carnegie had put into the castle. This is American steel. Castles had the habit of burning down, so he had these installed to protect his books and priceless treasures that he had, and the castle itself. This gives you a nice little idea of how the day worked here. Bagpipes at 7:45, breakfast at 8:30, and that would be a great big sort of Edwardian Victorian breakfast. Church at 11:20, lunch at 1:45, tea at 5, dinner at 7:30, and then hymns at 9:30. This is a horn spoon, and if you ate your porridge in the morning, then you were given this when you left. It's carved, I suspect, is probably horn, antlerless horn from the estate, and carved and with Skibo.
Skibo is more than my playground. Those I invite here could bring my seed plans for peace to fruition.
If we look at the people who came to visit him, from heads of state through to celebrities of the day, people like Edward Elgar, Helen Keller, but then there were the politicians, both from the US and from Great Britain. And then we had the clergy, the university, the educational establishment. He was somebody who we would say today was a great networker, I suppose.
The 1902 summer season is the most glittering yet at Skibo, and we are joined by a surprise visit from King Edward and Queen Alexandra. Just a year earlier, the king had ascended the throne on the death of his mother, Queen Victoria.
There is a story that he had the chance to be offered a dukedom, but he turned it down. King Edward VII was saying, basically, you can have whatever you like, whatever title. And he said, no, all I'd like is a signed photograph of you.
After dinner, His Majesty is attracted to a sketch of the Diplodocus carnegii sitting in my study. Rather enamored by it, he asks if a dinosaur could be sent to England. I write to William Holland to inquire. May 1905. The British Museum of Natural History receives its very own Diplodocus dinosaur. The plaster replica becomes a public sensation. Dippy is such a success that I see its potential to win influence abroad in my quest for world peace. My life-size replicas straddle the globe in a wave of dinosaur diplomacy. I hear the distant rumbles of industrialized war. Troops can now be mobilized and countries invaded within days.
He worried that the European powers and the United States were spending too much money on military armaments, especially the British and the French and the Germans. They had engaged in the first arms race. They were building larger and larger and larger warships, dreadnoughts.
It saddens and fills my bones with fear as Britain launches the world's first dreadnought, a larger, faster, more powerful instrument of war than ever before. In response, the Germans set out to build their own monster battleship. I fear a race to disaster.
He said, if two men get into a fight, someone's going to get bloodied. But if those two men have knives or guns, someone's going to be killed. It's the same with nations. If they have these battleships, a skirmish can turn into a bloody war. He attempted to interest the leaders of the world in coming together and agreeing to treaties of arbitration. So if in the future there were disputes between the French and the Germans, or the Germans and the English, or the Russians and the Americans, instead of going to war, they would have treaties that obligated them to sit down at a table and arbitrate.
I give an address at St. Andrews, in which I call for an international court of arbitration, a league of peace to settle disputes, to hasten the abolition of war, the foulest blot upon our civilization. It is true that every nation regards and proclaims its own armaments as instruments of peace only. But just as naturally, every nation regards every other nation's armaments as clearly instruments of war. Thus, each nation suspects all the others, and only a spark is needed to set fire to the mass of inflammable material. I meet Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany to promote my plans for a league of peace among the great nations of Europe. To avert this coming conflict, I now must employ all of my hard-won influence with men of power. How fortunate to have the ear of Kaisers, kings, and presidents. Dear Mr. President, one more triumph on your path to immortality as the peacemaker. You will secure peace upon this continent, and soon Europe will come under its sway. If the German Emperor could rise to his destiny and stand with you favoring this. Key to my peace plans is the involvement of President Roosevelt. I redouble my effort to recruit him as my trusted spokesman for peace.
In one of the most remarkable stories in Carnegie's life, in Roosevelt's life, when Roosevelt left the White House, Roosevelt decided that he was going to spend a year going on a safari in Africa.
A letter arrives at Skibo. Roosevelt asked me for $30,000 to help fund a trip in the name of scientific research.
Carnegie knew the European leaders, but he did not have the personal introduction to them or the personal power that Roosevelt had.
I know Roosevelt is not a rich man, so I seized this opportunity. I will fund his year-long African safari if, on the conclusion of the trip, he serves as my peace envoy to Europe. He accepts the mission. You're supposed to be after big game, my friend. All very well for a holiday, but of course, unworthy as a pursuit of one who has played, and in my hope and belief, is yet to play a great game in the world. Shall be so glad when you've started upon your return, and hope you will make it a point of meeting the big men of the world. These are the big game, although your present holiday was well earned.
You are quite right about my trip here being only play, but I think I can make the play of some serious use. I shall be a very short time in Europe, as I shall be anxious to get back to America. Nevertheless, whatever you wish me to do, I shall certainly strive hard to do.
If any man can get the Emperor in accord for peace, you are that man. He will go far to act in unison with you. Of this I am certain. You are sympathetic souls.
When I see the Kaiser, I will go over the matter at length with him, telling him I wish to repeat our whole conversation to you. Then I'll tell it all to you when I am in London.
The African safari is deemed a success. Roosevelt shoots a total of 512 beasts, including 17 lions, 11 elephants, and a 20-strong crash of rhinoceroses.
In the spring of 1910, Roosevelt returned from Africa and began his triumphant march through Europe. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in Norway for his having, while president, arbitrated a peace agreement between the Russians and the Japanese. He gave speeches in France, in Berlin. Everywhere he went, he was greeted with public acclaim. Roosevelt had promised Carnegie, and now, in 1910, went to meet Kaiser Wilhelm of Prussia. The plan was that Roosevelt would invite Kaiser Wilhelm or his representatives to London, where Kaiser Wilhelm would meet with his cousin, who happened to be King Edward VII of Great Britain. Roosevelt agreed to be Carnegie's peace messenger, and he met with Kaiser Wilhelm. The problem was, at the very beginning of this process, King Edward VII of England died.
On the eve of Roosevelt finally reaching Berlin, tragedy strikes. Britain is in mourning, diplomacy is at a halt, and my plans are in disarray. Peace talks between Roosevelt and the Kaiser, on which I have lavished $30,000 and 2 years anticipating, are cancelled. They are meeting unofficially, but sadly, Roosevelt will not be proposing my arbitration ideas. He does seem, however, to make use of his precious time in England.
My last 24 hours in England have really been the pleasantest of all, as I spent them with Edward Grey in the Valley of Itchen in the New Forest, listening to bird songs.
There has been a fatal flaw in my strategy to stop the war. A misplaced trust in those I counted on as my colleagues in my fight for peace.
Roosevelt took Carnegie's money, and Roosevelt paraded Carnegie into and out of the White House when he needed the support. But he did, in the end, really betray Carnegie. In his private correspondence, he ceaselessly made fun of the little Scotsman and his utopian peace plans. Carnegie sort of fooled himself into believing that Roosevelt could be his messenger for peace. It was not to be. Roosevelt went home. Carnegie's well-laid plans were laid to rest. But Carnegie did not give up.
I attend the opening of the Peace Palace at The Hague. It is the most auspicious day of my life. This temple is to bring peace, which is so greatly needed among his erring creatures. A permanent place of arbitration. The most holy building in the world, because it has the holiest end in view.
I believe that Andrew Carnegie was, as he saw himself, a leader of the Western world. And the Western world was falling into chaos.
It was a volatile time in the world. And Carnegie did think that he could stop war from happening because of his tremendous financial resources, that he could buy anything.
Gentlemen of many religious bodies, all irrevocably opposed to war and devoted advocates of peace, I hereby appeal, hoping you will feel it is not only your duty, but your pleasure to undertake the administration of $2 million in the cause of peace through arbitration of international disputes. We all feel, I believe, that the killing of man by man in battle is barbaric and negates our claim to civilization. This crime we wish to banish from the earth. We need to be aroused to our duty and banish war.
This is a historic room in Carnegie's life, and really in the life of the peace movement. It's the drawing room, and you can see it's beautifully decorated with gilt decoration. And it was the location where Carnegie met with business associates, where parties would be held. And it was the site of the first meeting for international peace in 1910. It's also the site of the first meeting of the Church Peace Union in this room in 1914.
February the 10th, 1914. With such high hopes, I hold my first meeting of my newly formed Church Peace Union, set up to promote the arbitration of conflicts around the world. It immediately sets to action, and within a few months, conferences are being held in Europe. August 1914, representatives arrive in Germany, hopeful they may yet keep the peace. From 1,000 miles away, their mission gives me hope as we enjoy our summer holiday in Scotland. August the 3rd, 1914. Despite all my efforts, Europe enters into diplomatic breakdown. The next day, Germany declares war on France and pours troops into neutral Belgium. That evening, Britain declares war on Germany. The Great War erupts.
Carnegie was horrified, absolutely horrified, because again, there seemed to him no reason for this war. Yes, the Archduke had been assassinated by a Serbian, but why should an event of terrorism lead to a world war? And he was devastated.
He was staying in a cottage up on the moors at Skibo, and the local minister came up to tell him, when he'd heard the news, came up to tell him. So people must have been aware of how vulnerable he was.
We are in perilous times. This war staggers the imagination. I do not underestimate its horror. But I hope and I believe that this very horrible, newly barbaric excess will so revolt human nature against all things, and that the reaction will be great enough to carry us into the realms of reason. And the realms of reason are the realms of peace.
I think when Carnegie was brought the news that there was going to be war, I think it just, I mean, his wife felt that it broke his heart.
All the young men and women who worked for him and worked in the village, instead of expressing and feeling the same horror he did, seemed almost jubilant at the idea that they would be going to war.
The defiant heroes of my church peace union still hold on to hope. Their conference in southern Germany continues in the belief they still may avert the slaughter. I am filled with deep horror that the men and women I have charged to help make peace are now themselves in danger.
They agreed to continue their conference, which they did for 2 days. Meanwhile, Germany was becoming a police state. Finally, the German police helped the conference participants to take what turned out to be the last train out of Germany.
As I read this today, what a change. The world convulsed by war as never before. Men slaying each other like wild beasts. Most casualties in this great war are injuries to bones from shrapnel and gunshot wounds. The human frame can't withstand the impact of this new mechanized slaughter. I have failed to stop the war, but the supreme optimist is not defeated.
He was a man who was used to getting his own way, and he would have given away his entire fortune to stop the First World War.
Trying to find sense in a world gone mad, it shatters me to think of my beautiful palace of peace lying dormant.
He couldn't go back to Scotland anymore because Scotland was at war and the Atlantic was dangerous. He stopped talking. He stopped writing letters. He ceased all communication. He ceased all movement. He retreated further and further and further into silence. He would be wheeled in a wheelchair to his garden where he would look into the sky. And he did not come out of what we can only refer to today as a profound depression.
Carnegie did think that he could stop war from happening. If anyone could have done it, he thought he was the person.
I may daily grow frail in body, but my hopes remain that one day war will be banished by an international court for peace. That day will mark the moment when man stops killing man, the deepest and blackest of crimes.
Carnegie died. He did not live to learn that the Great War would soon be known as World War I, because Europe would within a generation be embroiled in a second, more deadly war. Carnegie was intent on getting rid of his fortune, providing his daughter and wife with enough money to live comfortable lives, but not to create a dynasty.
He did not believe in inherited wealth. He didn't want to pass on his fortune to his daughter. I first remember going to ski boot when I was probably about 6 years old. It was like paradise. My grandmother, Margaret, she knew none of her family could keep Skibo going. But in the end, it was to be sold, and she left Skibo for the last time, but she didn't tell us. We weren't supposed to know. I did know. And so on that last day, I was standing in a field with my cows, and I saw the car drive past. I still feel emotional, isn't it silly, all those years later. With my grandmother in there. She didn't know I was in the field, but she was leaving. And I know my grandmother, she would never have looked back because that's what she was like. But I think her heart must have been breaking. For us as a family, it was never home from the minute my grandmother drove off that day. He left enough money to his wife so that she could look after his daughter. But really, he wanted to leave it so that it would benefit people who were less well off, give them a chance in life as he had a chance in life to get on. And that was his dream, and I think it came true.
If Andrew Carnegie was around today investing, Andrew Carnegie would be in robotics. He would be in the high-tech industry. He would be, I guess, a Bill Gates kind of guy. He knew trends.
You have universities, you have Carnegie Hall, you have libraries, all of these fantastic things that were built with private philanthropy as gifts to the urban environment, or frankly throughout the nation, that are remembered.
I find it incredible that someone, way back in the late 1800s, his clarity, Carnegie's clarity of vision of what he wanted to set out to do was incredible. It's kind of spooky, actually.
If Andrew Carnegie were alive today, he would use every ounce of his energy, every dollar of his money, all his wit, his charisma, his intelligence to create international peace movements that would stop the scourge of war.